All right, before we get to that, we'll do the legal lowdown. Last week, experts from across Australia came together at the Elder Abuse Action Australia Stand Up and Speak Out conference to discuss one of our fastest growing social challenges, protecting the rights of older Australians and preventing elder abuse. Now, one of the strongest messages to emerge was that ageism is far more than a negative stereotype. The way we think about ageing can influence about whether older Australians remain active participants in decisions about their own lives, with real consequences for their financial independence and vulnerability to elder abuse. Joining us today is Bindy Marshall. Now, Bindy's an accredited aged care professional and senior paralegal from Attwood Marshall Lawyers. Bindy attended the conference and is here to share some of the key issues and the practical lessons that every family should understand. Thank you for joining us for the Legal Lowdown today, Bindy.
Oh, thank you again, Miss Carla.
This is, I know, something that you're very passionate about. It's hard to think that we have conferences like this, national conferences like this, to discuss elder abuse. But here we are. When we hear the word ageism, many people think of stereotypes of discrimination. I guess, what does ageism look like in everyday life?
Yeah. Look, ageism is much more subtle than straight out discrimination. Obviously, it occurs when people make assumptions or have attitudes or policies or behaviours and treat people differently simply because of their age. Things that we see are, assuming an older person is forgetful or frail or lonely or unable to make a decision, or dismissing an older person's concerns by saying, that's just part of getting older. Or the big one, where we see them making decisions on behalf of the older person without seeking their viewpoint.
I guess then at what point do families and carers, what point do they start making decisions for older Australians instead of with them? And then that in itself, it becomes a legal issue as well.
Yeah. Look, I think it becomes a legal issue when a person's rights, autonomy and decision-making authority are overlooked. I want to point out that in Australia, every adult is presumed to have capacity to make their own decisions unless there is evidence to the contrary. So just because someone has a diagnosis such as dementia or Alzheimer's, it doesn't automatically mean that a person has lost capacity to make decisions. There is such an important distinction between supporting an older person to make decisions and taking over those decisions altogether.
Often we speak about capacity, the term capacity, but growing older doesn't, necessarily mean that someone has lost the ability to make their own decisions. So can you explain to me how the law approaches capacity and why that distinction is so important?
Yes, look, capacity is one of the most misunderstood concepts in ageing. The law is really clear on one point. Growing older does not mean a person has lost the right to make their own decisions. That's really important. Capacity is also decision specific. So if a person is perfectly capable of deciding what they want to eat or where they want to live, but they might struggle with more complex decisions like financial or medical or legal. And the other thing I want to point out is that capacity can also fluctuate from day to day. So people living with a cognitive impairment, they might be better in the morning, not so good in the afternoon. But more importantly, the law recognises that people are entitled to make their own decisions and, whether it's an unwise decision or not, or making a decision that family members disagree with, that in itself doesn't mean that the person lacks capacity. So it's frustrating for us because, the distinction between a person not being able to have capacity and, not being able to express themselves with their healthcare or enter into contracts or decide where they want to live or appoint an attorney or even give consent to treatment. It's frustrating for us to have to explain those basic principles to people, especially attorneys.
Really? Okay. Well, I understand it, and particularly as well when it comes to, the division of money and whether or not someone, thinks they're owed in terms of what they want to inherit and whatever else. I always Bindy find that there's always issues when it comes to money and what is owed and whatever else, and having to take up responsibilities. If you would like a question answered, feel free to text in right now, 0499 880 882, or you can email us drive@4bc.com.au. If you'd like to ask Bindy Marshall from Attwood Marshall Lawyers a question, you are an aged care professional, accredited aged care professional, and we are talking about the topic of elder abuse. This conference that you attended last week, it is one of these, we talk about an aging population. We're only getting older, and it seems to be one of the fastest growing social challenges that we have. And financial abuse, it would have to be like the number one, the most common form of elder abuse, wouldn't it be?
Look, it is. You're exactly right. And, ageism and financial abuse are closely connected because ageism creates the belief that an older person is less capable or less informed or less entitled to control their own lives. And once those assumptions take hold, it can become, much easier for other people to justify taking over decisions that don't belong to them. An older person may gradually lose control of their finances because family members begin saying things such as, let me handle that for you, or you don't need to worry about that anymore. And while their actions might be well intended, they can sometimes evolve into a situation where the older person's wishes and preferences and legal rights are ignored. And I think one of the greatest misconceptions is that protection and control are the same thing. They are not.
Yeah.
The law seeks to protect older Australians while preserving their autonomy or dignity and their right to make decisions for themselves wherever possible.
I guess, that there are those family members out there or carers who genuinely want to help an aging parent or grandparent whilst respecting their independence. I guess what legal planning should they be thinking about now? We speak a lot about enduring power of attorneys and making sure you have your wills and things in place. But, how soon should we be having these conversations, this legal planning, when we are faced with a parent or a grandparent who is getting older?
Oh, 100%. That answer in a nutshell is now. Families often wait until a crisis occurs before discussing legal planning, but the best time to have the conversations is while a person can still clearly express their wishes and participate fully in the decision-making process. The reality is that good planning is not about taking control away from someone. It's about ensuring that their choices continue to be respected if circumstances change in the future. Things to consider are, putting their enduring power of attorney and their advanced health directive in place. That's sort of step one. And making sure that their will reflects their wishes, along with making sure that they have their beneficiary nominations in place for their super, and their banking and financial arrangements are also really important to consider, along with their aged care planning. So I think families have got to open the dialogue and ask questions. What's most important to you? What matters most to you? Who do you want to trust if you need support? Those are the questions that they're forgetting. A lot of attorneys have their own viewpoints on these, and I know that those conversations can sometimes feel uncomfortable, but they really provide clarity and reassurance for everyone.
Yeah. I really appreciate you joining us every time you get on with us with the Legal Lowdown, Bindy Marshall. It's an insight that makes me think about our family arrangements. And, like I said, we're an ageing population. I don't think enough stock is put into this. And it's definitely one that we need to sit down and have with our families and our loved ones. I really appreciate your time, Bindy.
Oh, no, thank you for having me, Carla. Thank you so much.
It's an important conversation to be having, thinking about ageing, because we don't want to put our older Australians, our loved ones, at any greater risk. That's the Legal Lowdown there with Bindy Marshall.